Yes, so very interesting to, as I was just mentioning, to pick up from two presentations very much on the theme of what I'm discussing today. So heaviness in 3 dimensions. Obviously, heaviness is metal music's defining feature, and I'll just start with that notion that this idea of music that's lo-fi production, correct me if you feel differently, but it's a different aesthetic than heaviness. It's more about atmosphere, it's more about, would you say, Carl? It's more atmosphere, it's not about heaviness. So I'm going to stay with the theme heaviness, which is about size. As Niall was talking about, these producers are talking about making things sound bigger, making things sound more powerful. So while textures, dynamics and performance styles often vary, harmonically distorted guitars, this is the fundamental identity of metal music, obviously. Without distorted guitars, metal music would not be metal music. And it's interesting, the most tangible human experience of distortion is not a result of amplification or processing, but from the limitations of our hearing system and vocal cords. So right from an early age of human development, when we scream, when we're babies, our voice box distorts. And human hearing, when we hear sounds that are too loud for the human hearing distorts. We associate distortion from a very young age with power, with emotion. So regardless of listening levels involved, these connotations form the primary nature of heaviness and are central to the appeal that the music has had for almost half a decade. And very, very briefly, this is what distortion does to an electric guitar. This is an FFT, a fast Fourier transform, so a visualization of what distortion does to a clean electric guitar sound. I've highlighted 2 regions here. One, the lows from about 20 cycles up to about 120 cycles, then 1.5 to 7. This is a clean DI, that's the signal coming out of a guitar without distortion. And this is what distortion does to the guitar sound. You'll notice 3 things. Firstly, we've got more denser frequency content here in the lows, from the cleans here to the distortion, much more greater energy in the highs. And you also see the compression-like effect that distortion has. So this sets the context for music production. We perceive. Hey, Jonathan. No, we're all good. It was a reboot. We rebooted the projector and it's fine. Thank you. So perceived loudness. Normally, more overtones are produced when instruments are played harder than less hard. So what happens with these guitars is very much that the higher frequencies that are created are associated with loudness. So some of the music techies will probably know about the Fletcher-Munson curve, how we perceive lows and highs much easier at greater volume. So if we hear music with a lot of low and high frequencies, we perceive it as louder. So this creates the context here of heaviness. And what was interesting was the Dark Throne example, and obviously we talked about Dimmu Borgir's remix of it was Loud Blast, wasn't it? Storm Blast, I beg your pardon, yeah. And so this is a similar example here of perceived heaviness. This is a project that I remixed, and this is the original. So that was the original mix. And this is the remix that I did. So like greater sonic weight, much bigger sound, and I'm just going to talk about some of the production approaches, how I went about doing that, and the techniques of presenting heavy music in 3 dimensions. The first one of which, continuing from there, is obviously because a song, just as it has heavy guitars, doesn't automatically qualify it as metal music. If, Beat It by just because Eddie Van Halen was on that obviously doesn't make it metal music. There's a number of other sonic characteristics. So when we put everything together, the drums, the bass, guitars, vocals, we're perceiving music in 3 dimensions. A lot of you'll know about the way that we perceive music in 3 dimensions, the same that we perceive visually in 3 dimension. The word heavy suggests weight, and objects of greater weight typically accompany greater size volume. So I'm going to be talking about the way that we perceive sound size-wise. And we talk about three dimensions: the width, the height, and the perceived depth of metal music, and how they're manipulated within that. So the stereo image of a contemporary metal music production. So this term contemporary metal music, which is something Niall touched on as well, a lot of it is about an emphasis of rhythm. I've actually picked a demonstration here where it's fairly typical of contemporary metal music, which is there's a huge amount of ensemble rhythmic synchronization going on. In other words, you've got the kick drums and the guitars playing the same subdivisions as the guitars. All right, so the width dimension, the stereo image of a modern metal production is usually very wide by virtue of hard pan or almost hard pan rhythm guitars. With few notable exceptions, it's rare that there's any significant movement across the stereo image. But because of the brightness of the guitars, we've already looked at a fast Fourier transform of the guitars, and just going back to that again, this impact has a huge relevance to all the other signals that are placed in that. At the end of the day, the guitars are acoustic based, impulse based, so you can see that sustain bass, you can see the sustain of the guitars there, harmonically distorted electric guitars, so they're sustain based electric signals, and we put that on top of impulse based acoustic signals, and contrasting an electric guitar. This is a fast Fourier transform of a kick drum, and just look how quickly the high frequencies, we can see the highs through to lows. The low frequencies sustain quite a lot, but the high frequencies decay very, very quickly, which has a huge impact on how we have to manipulate. Toby, you were very right at a conference when we were across at Drexel. You said a lot of your methodology I use the same in country and western music production, and that was really interesting having that discussion. And you're absolutely right. The context with country and western music is very, very different, and it's I would say that it's the brightness of the guitars that makes it different, and I think there's different challenges, and it's probably the same techniques but used to a different degree, would you say? Yeah. So the way that you've got to get the kick drum and the snare to cut through the brightness of the guitars, there's very few other genres. There's definitely other genres like dance music will have very distorted bass sounds and very distorted synth sounds. So these techniques are definitely relevant to other genres. But the point that I was making here is that with these acoustic signals, these are impulse-based acoustic signals, on top of which we put sustain-based electric signals that are incredibly dense. And there's a lot of manipulations of those signals to do that. So that's generally the width perception, the panning of a contemporary metal music production. And this is a very, very averaged out display of how the signals combine. And what I've done here is highlighted the meeting ground of where the sounds combine, and you have to separate out the frequencies a lot in the low mids. So there's a couple of areas that I'm going to go into here, specific techniques for separating the sounds. The first one of which is to get a big production is you've got to make them play nicely. It's like a sonic jigsaw puzzle. You've got to carve the pieces up so that they fit together and that they play nicely. You cannot have these guitars, this massive wall of sound that just masks, that obscures all the other signals. You've got to make cuts into it. And you've got to carve out those signals, like I say, like a jigsaw, so that they fit together. So here's just a couple of images of some typical principles that will get used in a metal production, but also in country and western productions, just all rock productions, pop productions, etc. Here we've got the kick amplified around here at around 70 hertz in the lows, whereas with the bass drum, it's been cut here. This is a principle called mirrored EQ. You're not boosting or cutting the signals, you're mirroring the EQ moves. And you'll see that the cut in the bass is very different than the cut that's been applied with the kick drum. So you can see that they're going to separate. So this cut on the kick drum allows the bass dominance in this region. And similarly, where the kick drum is cut here, you'll also see that that's where the bass has been boosted. They're complementary EQ moves. Moving on to the guitars, the way the guitars would work. If this was, say, a Guns N' Roses production, for example, Slash's guitars are very warm in the low mids, then what you would want to do is you would want to give those guitars space in that area, let them breathe, let them have that frequency range by taking the bass out and letting the guitars dominate. Whereas if the guitars were very scooped in this region, you've then got a spectral opening to put the bass into that space where there's an opening there. And in this instance, when you start putting the guitars and the bass together, how the guitars and bass work together is very important. And the other really important principle is not to be making boosts and cuts at the same frequency. You get an unnatural hot region. If you're boosting, you need to distribute. One of the worst things I ever heard somebody say is you boost the kick and the bass together on the same bus, and that's completely the opposite of what you want to do. And by getting all these cuts in the same region, you get an unnatural spectral gap in the frequency range. In contrast, if you distribute the cuts and you distribute the boosts in the lows, then you get a much more powerful low end. So like I say, this is a principle referred to as mirrored EQ. The next, the depth dimension, proximity. What we've got, it's a fascinating one. Human hearing is absolutely fascinating. Those of you towards the front will hear a lot more high frequencies from my voice than you'll hear at the back, because the lowest frequencies that humans can perceive, 20 hertz, one wavelength is 17 meters long and not quite that tall, amazingly. The highest frequency we can perceive is 20 kilohertz, and that's 1.7 centimeters. The relevance of that is those very small frequencies get absorbed as they travel through the air. So human hearing, like low frequencies, very low frequencies will bend round objects, go straight through brick walls. Conversely, high frequencies get absorbed as they travel through the air. Now, this is what metal music's about. It's a lot about brightness. It's a lot about it being in your face. Berger Fales, who Niall referenced, pointed to that many years ago, that brightness is a lot to do with perceived heaviness, because it's about proximity. We get producers referring to a production as being in your face, and that's very, very much about the brightness, particularly with the electric guitars giving this sense of proximity. We've then got the sense of depth, which is created through cues that give us an idea that there is ambience, that there's a space, that it's placing these instruments in a space and giving almost a back to instead of everything being up front without any ambience, it pushes the sounds back. It's kind of like putting a barrier. It's the impact of causing more ambient sounds to be perceived as emanating from a greater distance. And this is directly, usually linked to the speed of the production. So very famous metal albums like Slayer's Rain in Blood, Rick Rubin was notable in that he used, I think there was just some reverb on the snare drum and some of the guitar solos, and there's no reverb on that album. But if you put that onto a Black Sabbath, the first couple of Black Sabbath albums, it'd sound completely wrong, because there's more space in the music, there's more space between the notes for reverb and ambience to exist between. How long have I got, Carl?
You've got 5.5 minutes.
Excellent. I'll go back to playing some audio examples. The next is the height dimension. So it would be rational to think that with home speakers operating on a horizontal plane, it would be rational to assume that the perception of height cannot be provided. But humans perceive the height dimension. We perceive, it's very interesting, we'll go to a gig and the low frequencies will reach us through the floor. They will come through our feet and they will resonate our chest cavities. That's why we love live music. You can feel the kick drum. High frequencies can't do that. They come directly to our ears. They can't resonate our chest cavity, or they don't come to us through. So there's this idea that the low frequencies come from below and the high frequencies come directly to our ears. Of course, this is reinforced with speakers. I can't quite see the tweeter here, but most speakers, you'll have the tweeter and the mids lower and the bass on the floor, and it's reinforced with the drum kit. We've got the kick drum on the floor, the snare more in the mids, and the metalwork up high. But so we perceive sound on a vertical scale, and the way that metal music is manipulated around that is very much to do with the speed of the music. Surprisingly, a lot of metal music has very little bass frequencies. Very little. If you listen to a production like Colin Richardson's mix of Evangelion by Behemoth, there's very, very little low frequency content because there's not enough space. You get fast subdivisions and it gets messy. And in this instance, we're talking about maximum sonic impact. We're talking about virtuosity. We're talking about virtuoso drum performances, where the listener needs to perceive the clarity in the performance so they can understand the performance. And there's often a link between metal bands like Opeth and maybe Slipknot and a need for clarity so you can understand the virtuosity in the performances. Whereas sort of more doom metal bands that are slower, there's less of a need for clarity, there's more space for the low frequencies, and that allows more space for reverb as well. What I'll do, just so, we talked about the high dimension, so this, just talking about low frequencies again, it's a lot about sonic weight. Sonic weight just isn't about bass frequencies, it's about perceived size. The perceived size and mass of this region. So what I'll just do in the remaining couple of minutes, let's see if I can just go back to unplugging that and playing some audio if I can. There we go. So in this production, this is the remix that I did. Breaking it down into its individual elements, what you'll probably be quite surprised to hear is that you'll hear the ensemble rhythmic synchronization. The guitars, the bass and the kick drums are all playing the same rhythm structure there. And if I just break it down to the drums and the bass, you'll actually hear that there's not that much weight at all in the kick drum. I'll play the kick, snare and the metalwork. Very little low frequency content. You go to the bass, and the bass, very little low end. It's all about the mids. The bass is in the mids. So with that chart that I showed earlier, the guitars are heavily scooped in the mids, low mids. So if you listen to this, these are heavily scooped. Actually quite thin rhythm guitars, thank you, Carl. Very heavily scooped, but then when you listen to them with the bass is actually filling in that region. This is the mirrored EQ principle that I was talking about, which obviously is used in other musical genres. I think it's used arguably to a greater extent within metal music. And you'll hear that even though the rhythm guitars are very full, you can still hear the bass notes. And it actually sounds like the bass has got a lot of low frequencies, whereas it's all in the mids. And then if I just add, and then the guitars are completely dry, whereas if you listen to the lead guitars, there's quite a lot of reverb going on the lead guitars. And that's got the depth perspective, so there's only reverb on the drums and only reverb on the guitars, and that's manipulating the depth perspective. Thank you for bearing with me.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.